All right, so for this next one, we're going to do a more stretched out, elongated arm pose at a bit of a tilt. But again, I want to start with primitive shapes. So just kind of a tilted oval for a shoulder, the upper part of the arm, kind of a cylindrical shape for that. And then the lower part of the arm. Now, one thing that you can do for any arms is kind of this lightning bolt effect. So you're basically illustrating the front of the arm, going back up to the side of the arm and coming down. So this works with male or female, but just kind of a technique that you'll see artists employ to kind of reinforce that bend that you're going to see there, and that you don't just get in the habit of going cylinder, cylinder, which can tend to look a little bit flat. But if you use this guide to remember that the forearm comes out right here and then back down, obviously tapers in very, very thin, and you can get a small cylinder here. A lot of times artists will even do this where there's a small cylinder here and a bigger oval here. So just lots of different little base techniques to get to where you're trying to go. And just remember with the shoulder, the reason why I like to do a tilted oval right there is that it reinforces the idea that it's just not a big circle or something like that, or even just an oval. You have to still take from this oval and go, okay, I've got a bit of a slant right here. And if I was to, incorporate some angles as I do this, a curve that goes here. And remember, like I said before, the curves will sometimes change ever so slightly to the end of them, that they're not just one big smooth curve. You might get some of the tricep here, have it slope inward, and then pick back up at the forearm here and come down into the wrist. So for the hand, we'll just attach this with a couple primitive shapes like this, and then get some fingers in there. Again, I tend to draw these with 2 segments at first, and then elaborate and draw in 3rd segments and things like that. So just some basic shapes just to get that going. And then from the inside, I think it's important to note the way that the bicep comes down and kind of passes in front of the other part of the forearm. So that's kind of the tricky thing about drawing any part of the body, is really paying attention to the connection points. The way that things slide over and connect to the next mass is a lot of times what will make it appear to be drawn a little bit more correctly than just getting proportions right, than just getting the right muscle groups in place. It's kind of the relationship that they have to one another, the way that they just slightly pass in front of and tuck behind other areas of the body, things like that. So again, if we were to get too overly critical and too overly anatomical about this, we'd start to separate all these different muscles and really detail this, and start to see all the little details into the muscle. But at the same time, it's going to look a lot less feminine and a lot less, kind of fluid, I guess. So, if you start to really show all these separations and divide, you're going to get a very structured and overly, again, anatomical approach, like you're trying to do in, a medical illustration or something like that. So what I tend to do is get it to about a level like this and think more about hinting to the muscles. So if I want to showcase a little bit more of this bicep, I'm just going to put a little bit of a line there. If I want to, I'll usually detail more in areas like the wrist. Generally, a lot of women, you'll see the detail from the wrist kind of appear, but then as it goes into this larger kind of form in this area, the details will become less apparent, and you'll just get more of the perimeter shape or the silhouette. So just little things like that. It's really up to you as far as how much detail you want to incorporate into your rendition. But that's just things that I look for in my own art style. So at a part like this, I would start working in more line weight and, kind of working on that silhouette, like I just said, and get in here and kind of figure out what shapes I really want to see in there. But again, I do kind of fight the urge to overly detail every muscle group so that it doesn't look too tense and too structured, and seems to give a little bit less of that feminine quality when you tend to do that. So again, as I add in the fingers, I'll start to think about the 3rd segment, so where I can show the divide and the separation of the fingers. I try to make sure they don't all go in the same direction, keeping in mind that the middle 2 fingers a lot of times will collapse together. The pinky will, like the index finger, kind of go on its own direction. Just little things like that. And actually, I've got this pointer finger a bit too large by comparison. And a quick tip for the hands, if I haven't already talked about it in this course, is basically the fingers are about the length of the rest of the hand. So you can look down at your own hand as a guide, obviously, and little things like that go a long ways. So as you're starting to draw this, and you see this hand actually looks too plain, and probably a big part of that is the fact that it's so straight up and down with the wrist. So just a slight tilt and move it over can sometimes, I don't know if that made it much better, but sometimes it can fix areas like that where basically it's because something's too aligned. We're very used to looking at the body and realizing that things aren't perfectly straight up and down, and they're not perfectly aligned and symmetrical with everything else. It's also why this arm by itself standing straight up and down looks a bit odd, because you don't really see arms even that are very straight up and down. The other thing that I would change about this just ever so slightly is probably the difference in that area. So I was trying to actually make a selection there. And I would actually condense this down a little bit more. So the other thing that I like to see, or that I tend to see in my studies and things like that, is that the forearm area looks taller. Now, I don't think it is based on the divide, and like we talked about, the positioning of the wrist. If you were to do a, kind of a circle and find out the angle or the radius, I guess, or pivot. But it looks longer, especially from a perspective like this, because we're getting this muscle group that's higher on this side of the arm, and this side looks lower based on the position of the bicep. So generally, this particular angle, especially, the forearm is going to appear larger. And in most cases, I think the forearm appears larger on the females, especially because, again, the shoulder is so much larger. If you were to just map this distance here, it's going to generally appear a bit more shallow in height by comparison to things like the forearm.